But I'm curious, your first thought as you started reading it and you go through it, like what was your impression?
I believed everything you said.
Okay.
Yeah, no lie. I believed everything you said.
Because I wonder if maybe I would reword it in light of what you're saying. I don't know that I would though, because
So let me just say that this is the chapter now where now we start
Mhm.
to disagree. Comments after
Okay.
that, but I appreciate that though. I think
Yeah.
that's pretty
Yeah.
awesome.
And I agree. I'm like, yo, you seem like a delight to hang out with. I mean, it's just
Thanks, man. Appreciate that.
uh,
No, same. Likewise. Likewise. I enjoyed our
uh,
conversation last time.
I'm thinking we could just go through, like you said, you could kind of give me your, just a typical conversation tactic is you tell me what you think I'm saying. I tell you if you got it right. And then uh, once you've understood me well enough, we can begin to
Mhm.
go in with, any pushback or questions or your clarification that you have. And we don't have to dwell on anything longer than we need to, or we could drill down in the area if you want. Uh, I have
Yeah.
no other ways. But I'm curious, your first thought as you started reading it and you go through it, like what was your impression?
I believed everything you said.
Okay.
Yeah, no lie. I believed everything you said. I thought you were spot on. Well, let me say with what specifically. I guess just starting with chapter 1.
Mm,
You talk about your time in seminary.
hmm.
So you were in seminary from 2011 to 2015.
Yep.
So um, you talk about your intellectual journey there. Um, you talk about I believe I just finished reading the first 3 chapters.
Mm,
I see that the first 3 chapters primarily revolve around the issues with Genesis 1 and 2.
yeah.
Primarily.
Hmm.
Um, but the main issue, um, sorry, I have my notes kind of
Hmm.
in the margins. Um, you talk about how throughout your time in seminary, people are trying to wrestle with these issues that arise from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And a lot of it you found a little strange. If I can quote you,
Hmm.
you say, this is on page 11. It says, rather, it was that the Christian faith was being presented as unfalsifiable, meaning there seemed to be nothing that could ever be said, no evidence presented that could disprove the Bible's claims, at least not in the minds of the believers. No matter what, we must explain away the challenges and defend our faith, even at the cost of our integrity, intellectual or otherwise. This was not what I had signed up for, because you found yourself at seminary reading
Mm,
these thinkers who were saying, okay, yes, but the Bible has to be true. So let's
mm,
find a way to reconcile this, even if it doesn't make
right.
sense. Um, so on page 13, and you kind of hammer this point home again. This is at the very bottom of page 13. It says, since my main struggles were with the opening pages of the Bible, and so you say it right there, my main
Hmm.
struggles. You say, I stopped connecting the dots between Genesis and Jesus. This was all I could do to protect whatever faith I had left. Jesus was enough, and I would be happy just to guide others to the vicinity where his claims could reach the ears of the marketplace of ideas. Um, so you go on to say more issues later
Hmm.
on in the chapter, namely evolution.
Hmm.
Um, and that's on page 16. The last paragraph of 16. You say, but the bigger threat was the more near and present danger of the theory of evolution. While I did not know enough to be as troubled by it as some were, what I soon learned convinced me that they were right to rethink Genesis.
Hmm.
So now, however, I don't, yeah, I think because you discuss evolution actually in depth in another chapter.
Yeah. Chapter
I
5.
Correct, yeah. I don't want to dive into that today
Hmm.
because I only covered the first 3.
Yep.
So that's pretty much what I picked up from the first chapter is just, I went to seminary and a lot of Genesis 1 and 2 doesn't seem divine for certain reasons, and there are these Christian thinkers who are trying to reconcile the divinity of the Bible, and to me, it's just not making sense.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, um, so mostly, yeah. But there's one thing, and maybe I didn't write this as well as I thought I did because someone else missed this point. But tell me if this rings familiar when I say it.
yeah, maybe I missed it.
Well, my main point in chapters 2 and 3 was not this doesn't seem divine or this doesn't seem right.
Uh-huh.
My main point in chapters 2 and 3 was so we can't take this literally.
Yes. Okay.
Does that sound familiar there?
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned that a lot actually.
Right,
That's
right.
that's I feel like that was you said that a lot in chapter 2 and
Two.
3.
Yep, 2 and 3. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so people who read it think that I'm saying that it can't be true in chapters 2 and 3. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it can't be literally true. It can be figurative. It could be all kinds of other things that people try to do to make it still believable, but it can't be literal. And in chapter 2, what I try to do is I try to demonstrate that it is a more fundamentalist approach to scripture to want to see Genesis chapters 1 through 3 as literal.
Mhm.
And even though I know a lot of Christians are getting away from that, I try to make the point that if there's one thing the fundamentalists have, is that they understand that the second you stop trying to make Genesis 1 through 3 literal,
Mhm.
you create problems for later theological developments in the Bible. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can either agree with the fundamentalists or at least the liberals, because the liberal, I'm sorry, not liberals, let me say that. The fundamentalists are the fathers of the literalists, the people who will say we need this, we have to take this literally. The more fundamentalist you are, it's kind of the more the extreme version of that. Everything has to be literal. The literalists are not as extreme as the fundamentalists, but they will try to
Oh.
hold your feet to the fire and say, but this is we're going to take this as literal as we possibly can until we can't anymore. If we're backed into a corner of science or history or archaeology, whatever, and we realize like, oh, we can't take it literally, then we give up that fight. But until that happens, we're going to take it as literally as we can, based on the genre and all those things. We'll take that into consideration, but it's going to be as little as we can. And all I'm saying is, okay, the more literal you try to take it, the more you run into problems with what we know about the world now. But here's why the literalists, so that's the strength of the literalists. The weakness of the literalists is, but we know there are so many things that we cannot take literally now. And so chapters 2 and 3 of my book is simply just trying to demonstrate these are some things that we know we can't take literally. So you
O-
kind of have to decide, what are you going to do with that dilemma?
Okay. Yeah, what I guess I was going to bring a lot of this up. However, you just did it in detail, and I appreciate that. But yeah, I was just summarizing chapter 1. I wasn't
Okay.
yeah, I hadn't gotten to chapter 2 yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
no, no, it's all right. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I was gonna say no. You were very clear on that. I
Okay.
don't think there was really a dispute about that. Because I was just talking about chapter 1, just the
Okay.
crisis of faith.
Yes,
Um,
yes. Yeah, sorry. You
oh
picked
sure.
up on my issue as I went through seminary was like that was a great quote that you read. Seemed like the Bible was being presented, or the Christian faith was being presented as unfalsifiable.
Yeah.
So the idea of there's never going to be anything that will say, okay, well then that's just not true. That anything that's unfalsifiable, I have a hard time standing behind it, because it just seems like the Bible could say anything, and I just have to find a way to accept it.
Yeah.
Um, and to me, I just think that's a problematic stance to have with anything. Um, but yeah, that's a good way to sum up my experience of the answers I was getting, the works I was reading, the way the faith was being presented. Um, and that might be a more reformed thing. Like there are other traditions of the faith where they're not so dogmatic. So maybe that it's a flaw of that tradition.
Hmm. Yeah. I guess, yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. I think that's a good thought.
Mm.
I think so. Your position is I'm following the evidence, but the evidence is not leading to this being a divinely ordained text.
Or at least inerrant. It's not leading to it being
Okay.
inerrant.
Okay.
So then I have to wrestle with, can God communicate inerrantly? And you got people like James White who will say, if it's or the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, like if it's communicated by God, it can't have error. It's against his nature to be in error. And so I have to wrestle with,
I see.
I didn't immediately jump to this is not divine. I jumped to this is not inerrant. And then based on the way that some Christians have presented it,
Okay.
if it's not inerrant, then it can't be divine. So I had to wrestle with, can God communicate erringly? And if he can err in his communication, then the question becomes, how do you delineate between what's trustworthy and what's not? Who gets to be the arbiter of that? And that was one of the most frustrating things for me.
Okay. I feel like we're gonna bounce to these issues,
Okay.
yeah, later in the conversation.
Mm,
Because I feel like the crux of what I want to deal with is in chapter 3. But
mm.
yeah, let's keep going. Let's keep
Okay.
going. So in chapter 2, so you say things in chapter 2 that I wasn't sure that I agreed with,
Okay.
and I made note of it. Okay, so let me go ahead and go from, and maybe you can put your, just to make sure I'm not taking you out of context.
Mhm.
Second paragraph of chapter 21. You say there are two characteristics that
Hold
we
on.
are
You said
generally,
second paragraph of.
page 21. You say there are two characteristics that we are generally taught to expect from divine revelation. The first
Mhm,
is that to some degree it will be incomprehensible. You say if an all powerful, all knowing divine being was to communicate with us, our frail minds would not be able to completely wrap around and understand that communication unless it was broken down and spoon fed to us in the most elementary terms.
mm.
Um, Now, just to, I guess, for clarification's sake, when you say there are two characteristics that we are generally taught to expect from divine revelation, what did you mean by that exactly?
Yeah. So this is a good question, actually. I appreciate this.
Yeah.
So one of the attributes of God is his incomprehensibility, divine incomprehensibility. So
Okay.
one of my favorite books when I was a young Christian was A.W. Tozer's Knowledge of the Holy, and he
Oh.
goes through the attributes of God. But divine incomprehensibility just simply speaks to the fact that it's almost like if you asked an ant to do your taxes. Like an ant, as far as we know, an ant is not going to have the bandwidth, the brain power to understand what your taxes are, or it's above his pay grade.
Yeah.
And God, one of the attributes that we're taught in Christian theology about God is he's incomprehensible. So I think it's Isaiah 57. I forget where it is. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my thoughts higher than your thoughts, and my ways higher than your ways. There's something about God that's going to be maybe mysterious. Um, the revealed things belong to us and our children, but the hidden things belong to God. There's something about God and his nature that just is above our pay grade that we're just not going to, that's just in his ontology and his nature. And so if that's true of God's nature, that we're not going to be able to fully wrap our heads around him, because how could the finite take in the infinite? That's basically the bottom line of that attribute. How could a finite mind take in the infinite? And so if God communicates, if the infinite communicates to the finite, you would expect that same attribute in some way, shape, or form is going to carry over to that communication. Not that God can't communicate and be understood, but inevitably you run into things that you don't understand,
Mhm.
And people typically chalk it up to, well, that's because God is incomprehensible. And of course, that attribute is going to play into, in some way, shape, or form, is going to play into, uh, what does it say? A.W. Tozer says, all of God's acts
Mhm.
demonstrate all of God's attributes. So when God acts, you're never going to see an act of God where one of his attributes is missing, whether it be his love, his grace, his wisdom, his power, his whatever his attributes are. All of his attributes play into all his acts. And so if God acts in revealing himself, his incomprehensibility is going to play into that action to some degree.
I was just going to say that, and I'm rereading that sentence. It says to some degree,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's the key because I guess again, like me coming from my philosophical background, I'm
Mm-hmm.
always thinking of analytic, just for clarity's sake.
Mm-hmm.
What is that degree?
Yeah.
And I think like for example, what's interesting is
Mm.
I just finished talking about this week to my philosophy class. We were talking about the problem of evil
Mm.
and how could God exist if evil exists. And it's interesting because at the end of the book of Job, that kind of theme
Mm-hmm.
is repeated again
Mm-hmm.
because Job's friends give this give this logic that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
but it's false,
Right.
which is you God is just, and so
You must
he
be in sin.
delivers out just yeah he
Mm-hmm.
delivers out justice, so you had to do something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly at the beginning of Job it's like, nah, I'm blameless, like I haven't
Mm-hmm.
I don't really do that. So and they're accusing him of all this sin and this and
Mm.
that. And at the end, like the interesting thing is the reader in Job has a bird's eye view
Mm.
of the whole situation, which is, Satan comes up to God and says this and that, and God's like, okay, you have permission to go do whatever you want. And we know what's going on, but Job doesn't. Job's in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at the end where when God, Job questions God, that God comes out and says, you don't know my ways. Like my ways are
Right.
higher than your ways.
Right.
So I think, yeah, so I think the theme there is, like, for example, we can figure out to some degree what that is, given that the scriptures are kind of clear on it. For one, like
Mm.
when we're trying to figure out why a certain evil is happening, I believe that to some degree it is the problem of evil. It's itself incomprehensible because we're like Job,
Mm-hmm.
like we're in the dark about
Mm-hmm.
the going ons of the
Right.
heavens. So I think that's one example I can think of,
Mm-hmm.
which was just my point of that story.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't. So, but you're here specifically. You're talking about divine revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it seems as if the context is really communication, like the way he's communicating to us
Mm.
is by necessity going to be. I don't know if that makes. Maybe I'm gonna interpret, but I guess watered down. It's not going to be like the.
Well, yeah, they call that divine accommodation. God accommodating himself to the level of understanding of the people he's communicating to. So even using language is God accommodating himself because, God doesn't necessarily have to do that. So there's a coming down, there's a condescension, and there's a accommodation of God speaking the language both literally and figuratively to the people he's communicating to. And part of God accommodating to people who are finite is almost a dumbing down of what he would want to say. But once again, because of that Tozer, that idea from Tozer, or that Tozer encapsulates, he just in his nature, in his ontology, he is above and beyond. And so it's almost as if, and this seems weird to say this about an all-powerful being, it's almost as if God can't help but to be incomprehensible because of the creator creature distinction. There is what the creator is, and there's what the creature is, that the creature is just not going to be able to fully take in the creator. And so, um, even in that communication, and I could actually be wrong here. Like somebody could come and say, no, God in his nature may be incomprehensible, but his communication is totally comprehensible, or else why would he communicate?
I was going to make that. That
Mm-hmm.
was going to be my position,
Mm-hmm.
simply because I find the incomprehensibility being more so related to, I guess, the way he structures the universe and the way the universe operates.
Right.
That's gathering from the book of Isaiah
Mm-hmm.
and the book of Job, because I believe those are the two references he makes to his divine incomprehensibility.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's not, I don't see any evidence necessarily of that being related to his speech, because my question would be, if God's if God has to, as you put it in the words of John Calvin, as nurses commonly do with infants, God is inclined to lisp in speaking to us. In other words, dumbing down his speech. Um, but my I guess my alternative would be to ask, how else, like, how, what would be God's way of just communicating normally?
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Because it's for example, and I remember you, Albert, and Jay Whip talking about this in your you have a podcast episode on what is meant by the inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
You have that, like, because it says the word is inspired,
Mm-hmm.
but what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how
How
was
does it happen?
exactly, how does it
Yeah.
happen
Mm-hmm.
exactly? And well, I guess what I would say is I lost my train of thought.
Well, no, I picked up on something you're saying that I think is good there.
Sure.
Because I wonder if maybe I would reword it in light of what you're saying. I don't know that I would though, because I see the dilemma you're having. Like, if God deigns to communicate at all, maybe, or wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he have set the universe up to be able to house his communication? Like,
Hmm.
why would he have to? Why would he not be able to communicate if he decides to? Why would there be some kind of incomprehensibility factor if he determines to communicate? Um, but here's why I wouldn't change it. One, like I said, because of the attributes and actions tie in there. But two, this is a point that I try to harp on later in the book, is the incomprehensibility of God almost becomes an escape hatch for believers when they run into issues in the text that don't seem to line up. And so it
Okay.
almost becomes like this card, this trump card that the believers keep in their back pocket. When I say believers, I mean the apologists, really keep in their back pocket, because if I ever do get into a place where God's communication doesn't seem to line up with what we know about history or the
Yeah.
world or whatever, um, I could always just say, well, God's incomprehensible. Who are you, oh man, to question God, like
Hmm.
Job?
Hmm.
And so, even though incomprehensibility is typically tied to God's nature, not necessarily his communication, it always gets dragged into that conversation because we know that there are things that we just cannot reconcile.
Yeah. Okay. So I I actually agree with that.
Mm,
So you mean it as a kind of, I don't want to say a negative thing, but I mean you kind of harp on that in your chapter, in the second
mhm,
chapter, because
mhm,
you mentioned, for example, Saint Augustine,
mhm,
and you mentioned how Saint Augustine, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but he, he talks about how we, if there are things that make the Bible look dumb,
or untrue or
yeah,
immodest. Yeah,
exactly. We have to say it's allegorical,
right.
and um, is this kind of like a prelude to that? Is you're
Yes,
saying
exactly.
this? Okay, so
Exactly.
in other words, this is kind of a cop out of
Exactly.
sorts. Yeah. Okay, because I would agree with you there. I actually agree with that point. I
Okay.
don't, because I was going to say, now I remember where I was going. I don't know
Mhm,
why I lost the thought, but with you, Albert, and J Whip, and you're talking about in the book of Kings that
mhm,
there is a lying spirit.
right.
And it's interesting because the writer of the Kings is giving this revelation of what's happening in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears as if God is talking to other spirits like the way we talk to each other, like
Mm-hmm.
who's gonna go down and
Right.
confound the prophets, right?
Right.
Um, so I would just simply say, like, no, I wouldn't buy that.
Hmm.
On the basis of I see no evidence for it. The only evidence I see of divine incomprehensibility
Mm-hmm.
is just the operation of the universe
Mm-hmm.
and the problem of evil,
Okay.
but not necessarily communication.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it could be shown again
Yeah.
in the scriptures, that is the case.
Yeah. And like I said, I think I'm tying in the attributes and the acts of God. And I think that there is, like, I think there's leeway for the apologist or for the theologian, for the Christian to say that the reason why some things don't end up making sense is because we have an infinite being communicating to us. And so it's almost like if somebody spoke fluent French
Yeah.
and you just, you had all you had was, you know, the first year in high school French. Just because of how fluent they are in the language, of necessity, there's certain things that even though they're communicating and they're perfect in communicating, there's certain things that you just would not be able to get because of where you are, the level that you're on.
Hmm.
Of necessity, some of their communication would be incomprehensible to you. It's
Hmm.
not a fault of theirs, it's a fault of yours, really.
Hmm.
And so I think people have tried to make the argument that whatever we don't understand about God's communication, it's not God's fault. God's perfect. It's our limitations that keep us. And so maybe the the incomprehensibility is not a mark against God. It's our inability to comprehend, not God's inability to communicate.
I would agree.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I would agree. But yeah, no, but overall though, I agree with the greater point.
Mhm.
Um, however, I went through, obviously having studied for this podcast session, I didn't want to ever say, yeah, it's metaphorical. Let's skip over that. Yeah, I didn't want to
Right.
do that. I didn't want to do that. Um,
And I would be
so let's
perfectly
go ahead.
fine. I would be perfectly fine with the incomprehensibility of God being an answer to very many things.
Mhm.
We're going to do a
Yeah, I
podcast episode about this, but my problem with the incomprehensibility argument or answer is the hidden things belong to God. Cool. Keep that there. But the problem is when the revealed things that are supposedly revealed,
Mhm.
when we run into problems with those, and then we start saying, oh, no, no, no. Even though that was revealed, take that back. That's a hidden thing now. And God's incomprehensible. Like when you start using it that way, that's when I have a problem with it. Not when it's just God's ontology and just, the difference between the creature and the creator. That's to me, I was okay with that as a believer.
You mean to say if something is revealed in the scriptures and now we got to say no, now it's incomprehensible.
Right.
There's a problem with
Right.
that.
That's the
Sure.
cop
Okay.
out. That's the
Yeah.
cop out version of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I don't. That's why I said as I was reading your book, I said, yeah, I actually agree with
Hmm.
Brady on these points.
But you are,
Um.
you have, matter of fact, I'm going to highlight this because what I'm probably going to do is I'm probably going to go back and sorry for those who already bought the book, but I'm probably going to make that a little clearer that I
Okay.
understand that there's a difference between incomprehensibility in God's nature versus God's communication. But when it comes to the communication, the incomprehensibility is really talking about our limitations. But then it becomes a problem when we use that to get out of theological issues. So I'll probably make that a little bit clearer.
No problem.
So
Yeah,
thank you
no
for that.
problem. Yeah. Yeah. No worries. So yeah. So just I guess to conclude the matter,
Mm,
on page 22, or sorry, I'll say this: the last paragraph of that section,
hmm.
before you get to the nothing new under the sun section,
Gotcha.
you say, uh, 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 couldn't it just be a case of us being too limited in our understanding to peer into God's incomprehensibility? The answer is yes. but the same claim of incomprehensibility could also be used as a smokescreen
Oh,
to
I do
cover
say
up. Yeah,
it.
yeah. So I mentioned, yeah, I flipped the page and I saw it to cover up inconsistencies, contradictions, and untruths within the page of the scripture.
Hmm,
That is the gaslighting to which the book's title refers.
hmm.
Um, so yeah, there you go. Let there be gaslight.
Okay. So to be honest
uh,
with you, I need to go back through this. I haven't touched this book in terms of reading it since I published it. I've only gone back in to
oh
correct typos and things like that.
yeah.
I actually need to refamiliarize myself with it because I'm having conversations and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that. So the part that you just read, I was like, I need to go back in and add that, but it's actually
Yeah,
it's out there.
yeah. No problem. No problem. Yeah, that's fine. No, I totally get it because I feel like after writing a book, you'd probably just want to be done with it,
Yeah.
move on to something else.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so now we can move on to in the actually the section "Nothing New Under the Sun."
Okay.
You say two groups of Christians will have very different responses to this. One says, "Of course, Genesis tells us the truth." The other will answer in a more nuanced fashion. It tells us truths, plural, in ancient culturally relevant ways. And now, just to kind of give a one sentence kind of version of what I think you're doing
Mhm.
here is you're basically saying if the Bible is divine,
Mhm.
it's got to be capital T truth, or not capital T. You don't put capital T, but you the truth. However, if it's just telling us truths, then it seems to be as if this can be any other ancient myth of the past. Because an ancient myth
Mhm.
can tell us truths about, say, humanity, or the Greek tragedies can tell us truths about the
Mhm.
human condition. But they're not telling us the truth. We know that Greek tragedies, like when I
Mhm.
read the plays of Euripides, I know that the plays aren't true stories. Like they're literally true stories. I know that they're just stories, but these stories are trying to give us a truth.
What
And
paragraph is that in?
that's nothing new under the sun.
Is it in the
Um
first paragraph?
correct. That is the very first. Yeah, it's the second sentence.
Oh, okay, got you.
Yeah.
Um,
So I take it that's my so just to conclude the point that I'm trying to make. That's kind of the theme that you're harping on in the rest of the chapter, which is this is either the truth and this really happened the way it went down and it's divine, or it's a good book of myth, but it's not true.
well, actually, no, I'm not even going that far yet.
Oh, okay, okay, no problem.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm granting it could be divine either way. It could be divine in terms of it's
Oh,
the truth, in terms of everything you read in it is truth, point blank, period.
uh-huh.
Or there are other Christians who would say it could still be divine, even if it's not the truth, full stop. It's stories that contain divine truths. So, what people often talk about, some theologians talk about um, the stories being the vehicle used to deliver the truth or deliver truths about God and his creation. Or they talk about the kernel of truth being wrapped in these stories. So, the stories don't have to be true, but there's a kernel of truth in it. So, if it was the truth, then that would mean even the story is true. But there are Bible believing Christians who say, no, 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 you've got it wrong. The story is not true. The kernel of truth wrapped in the story is the divine truth. So,
Mhm,
by way of analogy, if I said, all right, you better stop playing around. Remember the boy who cried wolf?
mhm,
The boy who cried wolf is not a true story, but there's a
mhm,
kernel of truth in it. And I think what I'm saying is that there's some Christians who would say, not to belittle the Bible to put it on that low of a level, but they would say there are divine truths in it. So one divine truth would be there's one God, not many gods. Another
mhm,
divine truth would be mankind is more special to God than the rest of his creation. Another truth would be something happened between God and man that created a rift. Now, the stories used to communicate those truths don't necessarily need to be true. God didn't have to say, let there be light. God didn't have to say, let us make man in our image for man to be special to God. There doesn't have to be a Garden of Eden for there to have been a real rift between God and humanity in history.
Uh-huh.
Those things can be divine truths without the stories themselves being true. So I'm not putting the truths on the level of the boy who cried wolf. They can still be divine, just housed in very human stories. So at this point in the book, I'm still granting that the believer on either side of that divide, it is the truth, meaning everything in it is true, or it houses truths. I'm still granting that both of them are right at this point.
Okay. Okay. That definitely helps.
Hmm.
Um, sorry, and if I'm looking down, it's because I'm
Mhm.
looking down at your book and I'm trying to I guess continue with that thought. Um, yeah. So
Oh,
then
I'm
you
sorry.
go
Let me
on.
say this too,
Yeah.
for you and for the person who's watching. What I try to do in chapter 2 here is I try to stillman the Christian's position. There's some people who think I'm setting up a straw man here, but I'm actually trying to present a strong case for, hey, even if it's not literal, it could still be true in this way. And I think I do a good job of presenting a strong case for how you could still take it as true, even if it's not everything in it is true.
Mhm. Okay. Uh, I guess yeah. I guess I'm reading it with the lens of the end of the chapter in mind.
Okay. I
Yeah,
got you.
because you you quote you quote William Lane Craig, and
Mhm.
I don't want to jump too ahead of this
Okay.
because yeah, I'd be jumping to the end of the chapter because I'm just trying to go page by page. But you let me continue.
Mm.
Um, so you go on and you talk about how uh in the next page, well, you quote Augustine, you quote Saint
Mhm.
Augustine, who says, I don't want to say the whole quote, but he says, usually even a non-Christian knows
Oh yeah.
something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of the world,
Mhm.
yada yada. He says, now it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of the Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And he says that given what we know about the sun, the moon,
Mhm.
the years, he says we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. And that's namely because of what people knew about the
Mhm.
world, the plants, the animals, the orbits of the stars, and thinking that like, hey, if Genesis says this,
Mhm.
there's no way this is true.
Mhm.
Um, so now so it seems as if and then you go on in the rest of the, not the rest of the chapter, but in this particular section where you're
Mhm.
talking about nothing new under the sun. um it says this trend of finding a deeper non-literal and a more mystical meaning in Genesis continued for almost a millennium until Protestantism curbed the enthusiasm of wide-eyed interpreters. And you go on to really go with the scientific revolution and say like we have a much deeper understanding of the cosmos now.
Mhm.
And so what do we do now given the text that we have in Genesis 1?
Right. If Augustine was advising
Yeah.
1700 years ago that people knew enough about the world
Yeah.
to not take Genesis literally,
Yeah.
what are we doing now that we know so much more? And Augustine had said back then said, "Hey, don't let us get laughed to scorn by talking nonsense about things that people now know that can't be literal." Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you go on and you mention um and this is kind of, once we get to the last second to last paragraph of that particular section, you say, yet if scripture is inspired by God and infallible, as the fundamentalists maintained, and if the biblical claim of God's supernatural intervention in the natural world is to be upheld, these same points can be used to argue for a strict literal interpretation of Genesis. And then you go on to with the final paragraph to say, yet scientific discovery has increased over the second half of the last
Mhm.
century. And now we're ready to once again admit that Genesis does not tell us the literal truth about the origins. So this is where you go on, then it connects to the beginning of the section,
Okay.
because you
Yeah.
say it's either the literal truth, the truth, or
Mhm.
it's truths. But the problem with truths is that you it's going to be hard to reconcile it with our knowledge of the cosmos today. Is
No,
that
no. The
okay?
problem
Got
with
it.
the literal interpretation is that
Uh-huh.
it's hard to reconcile it with our knowledge of the world today. The problem with truths housed in stories that are not true is who gets to determine what are the truths and what are just the vehicles used to convey the truths.
I see. I see. I see. Okay.
And how do you know that you're not just playing whack-a-mole so that every time a new scientific or historical thing comes up, oh well, then that was just the vehicle used to convey the truth. There's a truth in it, but the whole thing is not true. You just keep doing that ad infinitum. The more you find out about the world.
I'm sorry, that's really funny. The playing whack-a-mole. Like
Mm.
every time a new discovery comes out, hold on, let
Right,
me try to
right,
figure out how we can reconcile
right.
this.
That's not the truth
Yeah.
anymore. It's just a story that houses a kernel of truth, and that's the thing
Hmm.
that I remember saying. I don't want to do that. I don't want to play that game.
Correct. Yes. And now I think this is probably the most important section of this chapter, at least from my reading. The
Hmm.
most important chapter, the most important section, which is the breathe in, breathe out.
Gotcha.
Where you mentioned, I'll just go ahead and read the second half.
Mm.
It says, but Theo Neustos,
Theonustus.
Theonustus,
Hmm.
thank you, literally means the opposite. The passage is better translated, and you're sorry, you're to put this into context, you're
Hmm.
quoting 2 Timothy 3:16,
Hmm.
namely that scripture is God
Inspired.
inspired,
Hmm.
correct, inspired by God, and then you go into what that means in the Greek, and you said this passage is better translated as all scripture is breathed out by God.
Mm.
This paints a different picture, one in which Holy Writ only exists because the very words have their origin in the heart and mind of God, then flow from Him to and through their human conveyors. So now we're getting into the main issue with
Hmm.
just saying they're truths,
Right.
because it's very strange. I would agree with you. Um, I think what would annoy me, if I'm gonna be very honest, is if let's say we were reading about the tabernacle in the book of Exodus, right? Because the second half of Exodus is all about, let's build me this tabernacle.
Mm.
Here's how you build it. Here are the measurements. If somebody were to just sit there and say, yeah, this is all allegorical, I think that would annoy me, because I would say, I
Mm.
don't know, like these measurements are very specific.
Mm.
It's like this has to be 18 cubits.
Mm.
Like, why is he giving specific numbers? I think
Mm.
he's talking about a literal dwelling place, and
Mm.
someone says no, it's just metaphorical. I think
Mm.
I would have issues with that.
Mm.
I think it would make more sense to say this is oddly specific.
Mhm.
Maybe this isn't allegorical. And I think the same thing when I read Genesis.
Mm.
I think like day one, this is what he did. Day two, this is what he did. And to me, it would be very strange to say, if this was simply an allegory, why is he giving specific numbers to the days? I don't know. A lot of it would just be
Alright.
weird to me.
Some
It
people
just
get into numerology and talk about, why the numbers matter. If you
okay.
look at certain stories from neighboring cultures, you do see a number seven. You look at Zoroastrianism. There were
Mm,
seven creations of the deities
oh,
at first.
okay, I didn't
So
know that.
yeah, the numbers could be something like that.
My only study in numerology has been like the numbers of the beast. Because
Okay.
some say that he was talking about Nero Caesar,
Right.
given that Caesar's
Hmm.
name.
Hmm.
But I mean, that's about as that's the only thing I've ever done with that. But okay, yeah, I can see that. However, yeah, I would just let's just assume. let's just
mm,
assume for the sake of this chapter that you're right. Scripture, if it's true, or not if it's true, but if it's God breathed, um, it should probably telling us the truth. Um, and you go on to say, and I even put in the margins here, I am of this position. However, let me just read the one, two, three,
mm,
fourth paragraph of the breathe in, breathe out section. You say, Christian apologist William Lane Craig, shout outs to William Lane Craig, points out that Augustine's allegorical approach comes from an earlier church father, Origen, who preferred figurative interpretations anytime in a text, if taken literally, would imply falsehood or impurity. Now, this is exactly what you were talking about in chapter 1,
mm,
where you say we have to defend the scripture at all costs. And if it doesn't make sense, then it's allegorical or it's metaphorical or it
mm.
can't be taken literal. And again, you repeat that at the very end of that paragraph. You say, in other words, we can never admit that the biblical authors are wrong. Instead, we must stand ready to convert every problematic passage from literal to literary. So we're playing whack-a-mole.
Right, right.
um, Now, in the next paragraph, I put in the margin.
Hold on, real quick. Let me just go back.
Yeah.
So my point in breathe and breathe out is not that if it's God breathed, if God breathed it out, that it can't, that it must be the truth and can't be truths. Because I do think it could be God breathed and somehow God incorporates man's storytelling ability, man, what their word choice, their level of education, their idiosyncrasies, of personality. It can be God breathed and God incorporate all that. My issue with it being God breathed out is we have to take into account what the men, excuse me, what do the men bring to the table?
Okay.
And that matters because what happens for some people is when we do come into so one way people deal with issues in the text that if it's inconsistent or contradictory or just in plain error is they would want to chalk it up to the human component, but it's hard to chalk it up to the human component if it is God breathed out. So it'd be one thing if God removed the human from the process and just breathed it out and only used the human's hand,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then it's like, okay, that's a different issue than I'm going to use the human, I'm going to incorporate the human. If someone tries to pin the error on the human, you still have it being breathed out by God. So how do you decide whose fault it is, if
Yeah.
there is a fault at all? That was the point
That
about that.
no, that's a great thought. Actually,
Yeah.
that's very clear now.
Mm,
That's very clear to me. Because yes, being God breathed and now having a human scribe,
mm,
writer, or in the case of Baruch and Jeremiah, a scribe,
mm,
there are two ways. Either God, it could have been an error on God's end or an error on the human end.
mm,
Um, but given that God, at least just a priori, right?
mm.
God being perfect, I don't think God would make the error. So I would, yeah, I would
Yeah.
simply say that could be then the
Yeah.
human fault.
But
Um,
isn't that hard to maintain? I guess my the point I'm trying to draw out here
mm,
is if someone took that approach that it could be the human's error, how do you maintain that if God breathed it out?
you mean to say, how would we know that it's God breathed?
Well, not know. How do you justify the
How do we
idea? So
justify?
God incorporates humans for whatever, like I said, they
Mm-hmm.
are the tint on the lens of the light that God's shining. So you get it through Paul's personality, you get it through
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah's or the different Isaiah's personality.
Mm-hmm.
The human tint contributes a human element to it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you try to put error in what the humans bring to the table, that seems to fly in the face of, but God's breathing it out.
Uh-huh.
It's the content, not just the context. It's one thing for the human to add a flavorful context. But the content, for the content to be an error, seems like the content is not just something you could pin on the human. It's something that you'd have to go back to God and say, well, wait, the human may have wrote it or found a creative way to say it, but it was your idea. God, how are you not responsible for the error? Is the point I'm trying to get at there.
Okay. Can we come back to this?
Yeah,
I've
sure.
written it down. I've
Yep.
written it down. So I'm not gonna skip over it. Okay. Um, Nevertheless, I want to move on to the following paragraph, which is where you say there remains a strong contingent of Christians who argue that we must take the biblical text, even the early problematic chapters of Genesis, as not inerrant, but as literal and historical, because they warn of a slippery slope that Christianity will be placed upon once we begin labeling some parts of the text as figurative or worse, fictional. Now, can I say this? Number one, I agree with you. But number two, correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong. But you had the podcast episode where you talk about you mapped out your stage from a born again believer in Jesus Christ to now I'm a skeptic to
So the six
I,
stages of deconversion, that episode?
yes,
Okay.
yes, that one. So I saw the full episode, but you give the 6 stages. I can't remember um if that was one of your stages where you had to say now this we have to now take this text as um figurative instead of literal. Was that one of the
It sort of
stages?
was wrapped up in the first or second stage, I believe, going from fundamentalism or literalism to or dropping inerrancy. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't.
I don't
Yeah,
remember if that was
yeah.
one
Now
of
I'm
your
now I'm thinking
points.
back. I'm trying to remember. I think that may be subsumed under just going from fundamentalism to a more liberal approach to scripture or a liberal approach to Christianity. It may be wrapped up in there.
Okay. Uh yeah, so you would let's just imagine
Hmm.
a hypothetical example. If you were a Christian. Now I know that's a weird hypothetical, but a
I
hypothetical
can get
if you
there.
were sure, if you were a Christian, would you agree with this paragraph? Would you say, yeah, that's true, it is a slippery slope?
Yes, yes. And so
Okay.
my point several times in this book is that's probably the strongest argument that the literalists have is
Mhm.
once you begin to say, oh, that's a problem. Oh, well, then it's not literal, it's figurative. Once you begin to do that, where does that stop? Like, and like I said, who decides who gets to be the arbiter of what's literal and what's figurative? And if you ever see two Christians debating the Bible, I can almost guarantee you the thing that they're debating is one of them is taking something literal that the other one wants to take figurative.
Mhm.
That is almost every Christian debate, in-house debate. But who gets
I
to decide which is literal, which is figurative?
I once this was maybe 4 years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago. But there, I don't know if you know the podcast Unbelievable with Justin Brierly.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah, so I listen to that quite regularly,
Yeah.
and there was a one debate with that. It was Ken Ham and some other guy. I don't remember who it was, but
Mm,
basically we're going at it with Genesis, and they're
right.
saying, Ken Ham was making the argument. He's like, look, a lot of people they stop believing in the Bible and they fall
Mm,
into, they become they do this all because they have doubts. That's how it starts, doubts in
hmm.
Genesis. You mentioned this.
Hmm.
And he's like, yeah, it starts with doubts in Genesis. And the other guy is like, look, the planets are light years away.
Mm.
And so, he's like, there's at least 4 billion years. And so, yeah,
Mm,
so they were just going back and forth. I don't remember the
hmm.
specifics of the debate, but I want to say it was 2019 if you want to look it up.
Okay.
Um, but anyways, I don't want to get too caught up in that. I was just making the case that, uh, so you agree, I agree with you. Um, so if you want, this is the main point, and I will second everything you say here. Um, And let me just go ahead and read the last paragraph, not the whole thing, but the last paragraph of this section.
This is before
Uh,
what's at stake. Is that what it is, or in that
correct.
section? Okay.
Yeah, before what's at stake. You say, since the days of Judaism, and even by Jesus and the apostles. Sorry, let me actually read the set. So yeah, you say, still the first sentence. It says the Genesis narratives have been viewed as a literal account of human history since the days of Judaism, and even by Jesus and the apostles. Consider the response given in Matthew 19 when the Pharisees asked Jesus about divorce. It says, have you not read in the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? The two shall become one flesh. So it's clear Jesus believed that really happened. Paul is also clear the reason why women aren't to teach is because thousands of years ago, Adam was formed first, not Eve. Um, and you bring up the dilemma at the end. But if a God who cannot lie has breathed out these words, then they are trustworthy because they are true.
Mm.
And I would just simply say, yeah, I think you're right.
Mm.
I don't think Jesus was talking about a metaphorical or a figurative truth.
Hmm.
I think that you nailed it.
Mm.
And then you make
Oh, that's why you talked about the William Lane Craig quote. So that's coming up.
yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, that's
gotcha.
what's coming up.
Hmm.
So if you want, because you talk about what's at stake, and
Hmm.
in what's at stake, you talk about the first three chapters of Genesis. Not the first three, but you just simply say, actually no, you do actually. It
Hmm.
says a lot to lose if Genesis 1 through 3 is not literal. So you
Right.
harp on this sentence in the what's at stake first paragraph. In the middle of the paragraph, you say, uh, this is because there is a lot to lose if Genesis 1 through 3 is not literal. Some of the things we lose, and I'll just go over some of your
Hmm.
bullet points: confidence that the Bible is the word of God, an explanation for humanity's sinfulness. I agree. If this didn't literally happen,
Mm.
um, sin is almost like like a figurative thing.
Mm. Mm.
It's not like a real metaphysical problem.
Right. Right.
You know, an accounting for the presence of evil, clarity of the biblical position on sexual identity and family relationships, the origin of sin. So you list all of the issues that
Hmm.
happen, and in the so let me skip not the paragraph after your bullet points. Oh, no, excuse me. The paragraph after your bullet points.
Hmm.
You say, indeed, if any, this is the last sentence. Indeed, if any of the original passages that introduce these themes are figurative and not literal, then the ground floor of Christianity has just become quicksand.
Yeah.
Um, and you finish off the chapter with what William Lane Craig says in his book, which is his search for Adam and Eve. He says, the view that I've come to is the end of a long, long struggle with these issues. 2 years. You ask what's at stake is the infallibility and inerrancy of the New Testament. I suppose I had this sort of rough idea, but no, I really struggled with this and wrestled with this. The most difficult part of this whole question is not the Old Testament material, it's the New Testament. And now you connected that thought in the previous section because you say Jesus believed it, Paul believed it, their theology rests on it. And William Lane Craig says, the New Testament material, the statements of Jesus himself about Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, and this primeval history where Jesus seems to believe in the historicity of these events. So if you say that these are not historical persons and events, that means that Jesus held false beliefs, and that is incompatible with his omniscience, that's incompatible with his deity. So as crazy as it sounds, I think what's at stake is the deity of Christ, which is a very
Mm.
uh I mean he says what's at stake is the deity of Christ.
Mm.
Meaning if this isn't true,
Right.
Jesus ain't God, is what he's
Mm.
saying.
So I came across that video of those two, Joshua Swamidas and Bill Craig, having this discussion after I had already come through my ordeal. And I thought
Hmm.
I was in the wilderness for 5-6 years alone, wrestling with all this.
Mhm.
So to have written my, I had written my book already. I had written this chapter already, really, and then found that video. And even though he and I came to different conclusions because he's still a believer, I'm not.
Yeah.
But to hear him say that, my heart melted. I was like, I didn't know about Justin Brierly. I didn't know about, the online skeptic community or none of that. I was
Mhm.
in the desert alone.
Mm.
So to hear Bill Craig say that, I was like, finally, someone outside of my mind validating the struggle that I was going through.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, you know what? I agree with William Lane Craig. I mean, honestly, I just read this and I'm like, yeah, I mean, it makes
Mm,
sense. He's a logical guy. The logic makes sense.
mm,
So I just, yeah. So that's exactly why you asked me in the beginning. You said,
mm,
what did you think? I said I agreed. I agreed
gotcha,
with, yeah. So
gotcha.
I'm on board. I'm on board with chapters 1 and 2.
Okay,
I'm not even going to dispute any of it, really.
okay.
Which leads us then into chapter 3.
Like literally.
Like literally, yes,
Yeah.
sir. So let me just say that this is the chapter now where now we start to
Hmm.
disagree.